Thank you all for coming. I'm here to talk to you guys a little bit about data. I must say, because you all come, I lost a bet with my colleague. I didn't think there'd be this many people at 5 o'clock. I figured I stood between the bar and some folks and some food and some folks, and that I'd just be talking to friends up here. And it looks like I've lost that bet. So Janelle, I will buy dinner tonight. So my name is Martino. I'm a practice director at Optiv. I report into the identity data management practice or domain, and my responsibilities are data governance and data protection. A lot of that does slip into privacy as well, and a lot of it is a lot of consultative work, really getting the business involved, not making it a technology play, but we do deploy technologies within my practice that focus on identities and the movement of data. So big, complex challenges, big problems, right? I said earlier on a panel that in an organization, no matter what size it is, there will be people who have to interact with sensitive information. That's just by the nature of their job function. And we're seeing in IAM the need to have these things governed. I think Aaron, if you were here for his last session, talked about governance. And those same people who are managing the identities, they need to start managing the data as well, right? These are two assets in the organization that typically go unmanaged. And if the finances were managed like these assets, you'd be broke. You wouldn't have a business anymore to be ran. And it's time to get the business involved. IT can no longer steward the business's data. Unless it's IT data, it is not their role to steward that data. It is the business's asset. But we're finding what we're doing is granting access to them via tickets, right? IT just serving out the ticket. Make my account look like Janelle's account because she has some access that I need. Right? And we're overexposing those assets now. And so think about these things as these big complex problems have all different things that you got to think about around them, right? With identity, you're thinking about single sign-on, multi-factor authentication, identity governance, privilege account management. Well, on data, we got to do similar, right? We got to think about who has access to it, so data access governance. We got to think about movement and use. How does that data move throughout the network, right? So we got to think about DLP. We got to think about encryption, right? How does it get encrypted? When it should be encrypted? How should the data be treated? These are all business challenges. So when you think about that identity governance committee, it's those same folks that need to talk about data, right? It's the same individuals that are there to govern the data. It's the same individuals that will be there to give you the business strategy around data. And if you think about, we talked about it in the digital transformation panel, it is this information that the business needs for that transformation to drive revenue. So these are big, complex business challenges. And we got to quit driving them from IT without the business being involved. Our practice sees these things having to be managed throughout its life cycle, right? We've combined our practices to be identity governance, access management, data governance, and then around that whole thing is strategy, right? There was a strategy consultant component in our organization that helps organizations kind of build those governance and those policies. But this is how it's got to be governed and how it's got to be managed. It can't be separated anymore, and we realize that, and that's how we organized around it here at Optiv. Every organization has customer challenges, right? And GDPR and CCPA, these are outstanding marketing terms. I've got you could Google search probably 25 different partners or different technology vendors that say they solve for GDPR, right? Or they solve for CCPA. Or they're going to do something around NYDFS, or the next privacy regulation, The GDPR, the only thing it really did is change the way our regulators are going to audit us, right? Every one that was breached was PCI compliant. You're going to move away from this checkbox compliance where I say, hey, to be PCI compliant, you have to have encryption. Do you encrypt? I encrypt. But you don't think about, well, what good is the encryption if everyone in this room has access to it, decrypt it? So what was the value in that effort? Or, they want to say, okay, do you have DLP? Well, yes, we have semantic DLP. Great, but it's not doing anything. It's not blocking anything. It's not protecting movement. It's sitting as an after effect because I implemented it without the business. I broke something. I'm not getting ROI or value. So the GDPRs, they just changed the way that lens is going to be looked at now. It's going to go from that short division, well, what's the answer, to long division. Show me your work. Show me how you're doing that. Show me how you're protecting that asset. I think that's one of the benefits I saw from GDPR, and it's one of the things I see with CCPA. It's a lot about show me your work. Let's say we're not regulated. Last year, I saw a report that in 2018, the most sought after asset was PII and IP theft. You saw it with Uber and Waymo, right? You saw them take the LiDAR technology. Those weren't, that wasn't someone going in a data center and picking up the sand. That was 100,000 files that was on a USB drive. You probably saw the, my background is I was in the Navy. I was in the Navy for 11 years. I served in Desert Shield, Desert Storm, and Desert Watch, all 3 war campaigns. I served aboard the Nimitz, and I worked on F-18s and S-3s. So when China steals the F-35 plans and designs, and they build their J-20 airplane or strike fighter, if you put these planes right next to each other, no decals, they look identical. So intellectual property is becoming an asset that we need to start protecting, even if you're not regulated. Brand, I think you're seeing this a lot in the law firm area, the law vertical, right? If you're an organization who does mergers and acquisitions and you were involved in maybe the AOL and Time Warner purchase, if that information gets breached, my brand just went through the toilet. I may not be regulated, but I have a brand to protect. If you think about the breaches that occurred and how much it's cost, those loyalty programs, right, to bring those customers back. They were, I think the last that I read from TJ Maxx was $233 million, I think was some of the costs from the impacts to that brand. Talked a little bit about compliance. The technologies, getting in control of what's doing what, having assets that aren't overlapped and understanding what those are, I think is a big challenge that I see a lot. And I think that's driven by that ad hoc spending, right? An event has occurred by technology, or something has happened, the CEOs talk, and it's one CEO to the other CEO that he has DLP, and then you're buying a technology. So I think that all these challenges are really business challenges, and they have to be brought up to that level and be talked about at that level. How many folks in the room do phishing campaigns internally in your organization? And how many of y'all know what the click-through is? Is it above 10%? Sitting at 10%? Somewhere out there? Lower? That's really good. So I was in San Diego, it's where I live, and I was at a round table of CISOs talking to them about just what they were working on, what they were touching, what was driving their day-to-day firewall deployments, next-gen firewalls. This guy had an F5 problem. And I'd ask them, I said, well, what are you guys doing about phishing? How does that work for you? And they were like, we're not doing anything. One guy said, we can put in the email, this is a virus, and our users would click on that email. and I thought to myself, I said, but did you realize this is not your problem to have to deal with? Right? It's your problem to educate the business. It's really who's going to change that behavior is probably someone in training, right? Someone in HR is going to change the culture of the organization. It's not IT's job. But I just found it odd that they failed, that they knew they had a problem. It is the highly successful problem, and they didn't want to address it. And I just felt like if you had the right partnership and you partnered horizontally with HR, you'd have a partner that you could say, hey, look, this is a risk. This is what occurs. This is what's happening. We've got to change the behavior in the organization. And so, again, having that governance committee, having it managed at that level is important. And this is where we're seeing that identities and data is coming kind of together, right? The criminals only want 2 things. Identity, what kind of information you have access to, what kind of data you have access to. So we have to start managing these a little bit better. I think the only other thing that's not on this challenge that I would add to it is the fact that we're losing control where the information's going, right? We can't seem to locate it. It's going to the cloud. It's on the mobile device. It's on a SharePoint site. It's on the laptop. It's everywhere. It's growing dramatically, and it's another challenge I think that the customers are being faced with. So concerns, this is why the governance committee is important. Each one of the people in the organization who's in charge for managing risk is going to have a different concern. I'll give you an example. In my younger days, I sat on an identity and data governance committee. And at that committee, everything that touches the organization around those 2 subjects had to be surfaced. It's where projects were funded from. It's where strategies were laid out at. One of the things that occurred in that meeting, and it really was an eye-opener for me, was the HR team and the telecom team, they decided to kind of come together and how great of an experience it would be as if they put voicemail into email. This was going to be a productivity enhancer. This was going to drive so much happiness within the organization. They did this big presentation. Halfway through it, maybe they allowed it to go over half, but the lawyer said, we're absolutely not doing that. Not at all. Because in his perspective, he knew that from compliance's lens, we had to keep that email for 10 years. And now he had to defense voicemails. And that was going to be a challenge. That was going to be a problem for him. He also was the same person that noticed that the CMO couldn't keep customer data forever because it was opening that risk for them in the organization. So again, having them at the table, talking about the strategies, talking about identity and data together is really what's going to help make that program successful and move you guys along on that journey. I talk about this journey, and people often say it's a hard place to start. Where do I start? Where do we go? How do we tie it all together? I always tell them, get to the bullseye. That's my goal. After there, I don't care where you go, but I want to get to that bullseye. And I'll get to that bullseye for 3 different reasons. Reason number 1 is once I have that data owner identified, I'm going to start working on getting to least privilege concepts, right? Only people who need access to the information will have access to the information. The data owner will help me get there. They will be able to tell me who in the business needs access to the information. The second reason why I want that data owner is I want to enable my DLP program with information from the business. Typically, you deploy a DLP tool, you look at the glass for about 18 to 24 months, you tune false positives, you try to implement policy, you break the business, you roll the policy out, you never re-implement DLP, right? So it gets a bad name. So if I have a data owner now, I can actually talk to someone in the business about how the assets to move. Should it go out to Gmail? Should it be downloaded to a USB chip? They're going to tell me that. The business will tell me that, not IT. And the third reason why I want to get to the data owner is let's get the productivity suck out of IT and get it back in the hands of the business and let them grant and revoke access to their assets. So that's why I want to get to that target. And to do that, we'll definitely want to start with that governance committee. If you can't start with that governance committee, there are things you could still do, right? All these technologies you're going to deploy and anything you're going to work on to get the least privilege is going to ride on Active Directory. If you don't know what Active Directory looks like, or you don't have a lens into how it's being managed, then you could be unable to enforce least privilege. An example, if I have in the directory tree a folder that I'm applying permissions to, but inheritance is broke, how do I know that permission got applied effectively? I have no clue. It may not even be applied appropriately. I've left the business open to risk again. I've left another hole in the environment. So I always tell them, take a peek at Active Directory real quick. You don't have to have a governance committee to do that, right? Let's take a peek at these fundamental things before we start going on to the bigger stuff. The other thing I try to tell them to do is get a scan, right? Figure out where these assets live. Where are they at? And you don't have to boil the ocean for this. You all know what's important information, PII, PCI, HIPAA, et cetera, right? We don't have to get into a big, complex classification policy to do just those 2 pieces, and that gives you kind of a picture, right? It lets me know what I have to do. Lets me know where my assets are, gives me a little bit of idea of how Active Directory is looking in terms of managing, and it puts me on a trajectory to go ahead and get to least privileged. After that, you do have to classify those policies, right? We do have to have classification policies and standards, but you have to create them with the mindset of the person using it, right? It's almost like a product manager. If I'm going to build a product, I want to make sure I got customers to use this product, right? Well, if I'm going to build a policy, why not build it around the people we want to use the policy? Otherwise, they're just going to find workarounds around it, right? They're going to find a way to make their job easier. So I say you can start building that classification and standard up with the business. They own it. Socialize it with the business. Perform those tabletop exercises with those business units. When you think about GDPR, every technology vendor says they solve for Article 17, right? The right to be forgotten. All of them say they do it, but what they fail to even think about doing is understanding how the information got in there in the first place. So if I can't figure out how the data gets in there, how can I make sure I took it out effectively, right? So we're saying to say, hey, as you're scanning your environment, start working with the business to define how the asset comes to life, lineage, right? Where does it come into? How does it get into the tool? Then what do you do with it? And make those mappings and make those flows and process flows so you can start seeing the bigger picture. And then I have the scan. I have an idea of where these assets are. I have a socialized policy. What I could start doing is reducing risk by taking out everyone groups. Can't tell you how many times we've done scans and how much data is overexposed because the everyone group is in that access control list. These are quick wins, right? Start showing it in terms of metrics that I could show that I'm reducing risk in the organization, because before 90% of the organization had access to the finance records. Now only 10 people do, right? You can start showing that metric, showing that stat. And then again, working with the data owner, I can enable everything else. I don't want to go to encryption until I get the access right? And I don't want to start putting DLP movement and usage policies in place without knowing the owner. But everything else after that kind of just helps the process in the program. With unstructured data, it's really important to understand and baseline what normal behavior is, right? This data tends to be disjointed from any other business process. It's neglected. The business uses it for a brief period of time, and then it stays there forever, right? And so we really have to have good analytics and user behavior that says, Ralph uses this data every Tuesday. Why all of a sudden is he doing something with it Wednesdays and Thursdays, right? And that's probably the simplest form, but you need to have analytics and know what normal behavior is, know how many times I send that file out of the organization, know how many times I write that file. So analytics is that big piece in there too to help also minimize that risk with data. And it's centered around some of the identity stuff. There's not one analyst, there's not one article you'll ever read that will say incident response teams are ineffective. That is the only way you are going to minimize this risk, is having an incident response team in place. The mean time to detect and the mean time to contain a breach all relies on that team being in place. And it's also important to exercise it. When I was in the Navy, I can't tell you, when we left San Diego to the Persian Gulf, we drilled every day, every night. It didn't matter if I worked 15 hours. We had a man overboard drill. I had to go to the location and tell him I wasn't the guy overboard. We drilled and drilled and drilled, because once we hit the Straits of Hormuz and went into the Persian Gulf, everything after that would be for real. And there's no better time to know I'm ready than all that training I had going up leading to that time. But if I sit here and say I have an incident response team, I have incident response processes, but I don't exercise them, when that event happens, how do I know who's going to do what? How do I know how effective they're going to be? How many times have they ran through that? Or is it just going to be a fire drill, people running around and doing a bunch of stuff that's getting nobody anywhere? So it's really important to have those IRT processes and procedures, but it's even more important to exercise it, test it, do something with it. I use that term ADKAR. I'll just really quick. ADKAR stands for awareness, desire, knowledge, ability, and reinforcement. It's usually typically taught by folks in HR, folks in training, folks who are going through an organizational change, whether that be transformational or not. It's really a way to change behavior, right? I create awareness in the organization and a desire for them to change. I arm them with knowledge. I give them the ability, but I constantly have to reinforce the message. Constantly have to reinforce it. So that is the best way to do that, because as data owners, they're going to have to do something different than what they were hired to do. And it's going to be how well they're trained to do that new job will show you how effective they could be as data owners. So my area, a little bit, data is big. There's a couple different areas on it. We could talk structured and unstructured. We could talk about value of the data. I mean, you've got to look at it in all different kinds of lenses, right? I have to know that the data that sits in the application has gotten the right front door controls. So your IAM program guarding that front door. I got to realize that the DBA, by his role or her role in an organization, they'll have access to information. I have to decide if they should see it. Should I have it masked at rest because I want to protect it from the DBAs? There might be DevOps groups that needs that information. You might think about how it gets transmitted in flight, if I want it masked or obfuscated in flight. So as you drill down, there are just going to be areas you're going to need to focus on. Even within the database, you have database activity monitoring, right? What's going on when the DBA is in the database? What is he doing or she doing in there? The protection, like I said, a little bit of encryption at rest, in flight, definitely DLP, right? We want to make sure it's moving around the network like it's supposed to. And definitely have the right classification standards and policies as well. I mean, those are some of the things I look at the very beginning of the policies and standards, right? Do we know what sensitive information is? And if we know that, then do we know where it's at and who has access to it? And in terms of those privacy laws, you're not going to keep up with all 50 states. There's no way you're going to keep up with all the privacy laws for every state that's going on. You're going to have to just realize that people need access to information to make the business run. And you're going to have to make sure that the right people have that right access, whether that's in the app or out of the app. That's going to be the critical stuff. And I do believe I have 4 minutes for questions. Otherwise, I appreciate your time for 20 minutes. Yes? I think the most important thing you can do, it's a term coined by someone in the room, it's whiff 'em, right? It's basically you've got to show them what's in it for me, right? They got to take the lens from them. First you got to speak the language of the business, right? And then you got to take it from the lens of, okay, what's going to be in it for them? How am I going to get them engaged? And then it's that, again, awareness and desire. That's how you create that, because now I've identified what's important to you. I've shown you what some of that risk area is and why we're going to need to do this. And now I'm hoping that you're wanting to come on board and help drive that in the organization. I think it's also from leadership, right? Top down, it has to be an initiative. It can't be us trying to push it up. So there again, we need to manage upward a little bit. Make sure we're speaking the language of the business. We're showing them what's in it for them and what the risk is. That's the language of the business. So that's the best way I can put it out there to you. If I can figure out what's important to them, I'm going to have an ally and an asset. And in terms of their role, it's defining it. Like we defined, it's legal's role to look at everything we're doing in terms of legal. What's defensible? What do we have to do by law? For HR, it was like, we're touching the people. What do you guys need for the people? How do I change behavior? For compliance, all the compliance stuff. So they got to know why they're there, why they're being taught to, what's in it for them, and then create that awareness and desire. All right, well, I appreciate everyone's time this evening. Take care, have a great rest of the event, and thanks.